Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Marina Whitman. I should say Marina von Neuman Whitman. And we're going to talk about her book, The Martian's Daughter. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here. But I'm amused that the program is called the academic book because I can't tell you how hard I worked to keep this book from being academic. Having written academic books all my life, this time I tried to sound like a human being, and it took 5 or 6 revisions to get there.
Well, but it has a substance of academic life. And
oh, yes.
I found that was kind of charming and very instructive. I mean, it's just packed full of insights that are just really interesting. I mean, when you're talking about Henry Kissinger being a fellow grad student, and when you're talking about your teaching, there's a lot of the behind the scenes kind of thing going on.
Oh yes, there is. Henry actually was a graduate student when I was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
He's a few years older than me. And also I think he got a late start.
Yeah, so that was interesting, but one of the themes throughout this is the whole glass ceiling thing and women excelling, and you really set an early entrance into all of that. And so I thought first we'd talk about some of that, because that's something to be really proud of.
Well, I guess, of course, while I was doing it, first of all, the term glass ceiling hadn't been invented. Lynn Martin invented that when she was Secretary of Labor. And I wasn't really aware that that's what I was doing. I just knew that there were certain things I wanted to do, and I felt I was capable of doing them, and I just worked to push aside the barriers, always with a smile. My husband says I'm wonderful at using my sharp elbows, but with a smile on my face, and that got me a long way.
Well, you had all kinds of situations, even I think, who was it that said that they couldn't accept you as a PhD student because
they didn't have enough ladies' rooms. That was the president of Princeton, I hate to say it, in 1958. And the economics department, had invited me to be a student there, and my husband was teaching at Princeton, so it seemed pretty logical. But the department said, you know, Marina, there's one little barrier, you're going to have to go talk to the president. So I went and had this conversation with the president, and at one point he did actually say, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitman, we can't accept a student of your high caliber, but first he said, we don't have housing for women students. And I said, well, that's all right, because I'm living in the leftover World War II barracks with my husband, who's an instructor here. And so that stopped him for a minute, and then finally he got down to the ladies' room. And so I got on a train and went to Columbia and got a PhD. And many years later, Bill Bowen had asked me to be on the Board of Trustees of Princeton, which I did for 10 years. And Bill wanted me to go out to Meadow Lakes, which was the retirement home in which that former president was now living. And he really wanted me to engage him in the mistake he'd made. And I said, Bill, I'm not going to go out and bug some 90-year-old about the fact that 30 years ago he wouldn't let me go to Princeton. So that encounter never took place.
What a story, though. The same person who, the same institution that had denied you access, you ended up helping to run.
That's correct. That's absolutely true. It's the best revenge.
And you said some other historical things, like the council, that you were the first woman to be on. Maybe.
That's right. The President's Council of Economic Advisors. I started out being on the staff of the council, and that's something that reasonably high-powered young economists were often, academic economists were asked to do. And so that in itself wasn't terribly unusual. And I did that for a year, and then Bob and I went back to the University of Pittsburgh, where we both taught. But then a year or two later, I was asked to come and be a member of the council, and actually, as in many aspects of my career, the fine Italian hand of Paul McCracken was behind that, as well as George Shultz. And I guess they persuaded the president, and so I was asked to be a member of the council. And that was a blockbuster. And the president decided he would make some public relations hay with this, so there was an announcement by him that I was going to be the first woman ever appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors. And the reaction of the press was really appalling. Somebody collected for me all the press clippings from those days, and as I read over them, I really couldn't believe them, because every single one was headline, woman appointed to Council of Economic Advisors. And it got into things like the fact that my dress and my eyeshadow matched. And somebody asked me what designer's clothes I wore, and that was pretty funny because I was an academic. And the person in Pittsburgh was from the women's page, and she seemed most interested in how the family gerbils had survived the trip to Washington. And looking back, it's just unbelievable how this story was treated back in 1972.
Well, and what was interesting in these different historical things that you've done, there was this interaction, and they could not deny you because of your talent. I mean, it just was going to happen, but there was a lot of negotiations that were going on, a lot of stories.
Oh, yes, and there were the times when I was denied. There was the time when I was a senior at Radcliffe, and IBM was recruiting for what they called sales engineers. They weren't really engineers. They were people who were recruited to sell IBM machines, and they had, most of them, in fact, they were humanities graduates or social sciences, and they had to learn just enough about computers to be able to talk a good game. And it was well paid, and it was considered a good job. And I was talking to the interviewer, and everything was going fine. I was at the top of my class, and my name was von Neuman and all that. And then suddenly he looked at my left hand, and he said, "Oh, I see you're engaged." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, we don't hire engaged girls." And I told this story to my daughter and her very best friend when they had just graduated from college. And they, of course, were all excited to hear what kind of smart response I'd given. And they said, "What'd you say, Mom?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid what I did was stand up and smooth my skirt and apologize for taking his time and left." And of course, the girls' faces just fell. They were so disappointed. And I said, "You don't understand. He was completely within his rights. I could have laid on the floor and kicked and screamed, and it wouldn't have made any difference. There was no EEOC. There was nothing that gave me any right to object. And that's just the way the world was." And considering that they had started out by asking me, "Tell me, Mom, has anything really changed since you were our age?" And I was trying to impress on them that, yes, indeed, girls, things had changed.
Well, and when you're someone who's breaking those barriers, the way is not clear, and what you do is you just do the best you can do, but you're still making history when you have that happen.
Oh, yeah, you just do the best you can do. And you don't generalize it. At least I didn't. I mean, sure, the women who founded Now, for example, were very conscious that they were fighting for women in general, and they certainly believed that they were making history, and they turned out to be right. For me, I was just trying to do the things I wanted to do and thought I would enjoy and be good at. And it was really only looking back that I realized that this was part of a very major thrust that was going on at that time.
One of the other exciting things that you did was to get the position in GM, and or positions. You had quite a career there.
Yes, I did. I spent 13 years at GM. The those 13 years when it was going down the tubes and didn't know it. And there again, I think Paul McCracken played a big role. He was an advisor to GM, and I'm virtually certain it was he who suggested me to them. And I have to say, for Roger Smith, who is a much maligned character and to some extent deserves it, he tried by bringing in outsiders at high levels, at the level of vice president, to crack the GM culture. He failed, and he failed partly because of his own personality, but the fact is he tried. And he brought me in, and Betsy Anker Johnson from Oak Ridge Laboratories, and Elmer Johnson from a law firm, and of course the wildest one was Ross Perot. We all know how that turned out.
But there was, do you think that one of the comments you make in the book was about how rigid the structure at GM was. And, they went through this horrific experience just recently and have emerged. What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard to tell because I've been gone from the company for 20 years. And while I have one or two friends left inside the company, mostly what I know comes from the newspapers like everybody else. And it's very hard to tell. One would think that having gone through a decline and bankruptcy and more or less a government takeover and 3 different chief executives in 3 years, that if anything was going to change a culture, that would have. And certainly there are some signs that that has happened. But I guess it'll take more time to be sure.
The main thing is it did survive.
It did survive, that's right.
And there were people wondering if that was going to happen.
The people I know, both inside and outside the company, say it almost certainly would not have happened because, some people say, well, why didn't they just declare bankruptcy and why did the government have to get involved? And as I understand it, the fact is that there is no way they could have gone through bankruptcy as quickly as they did. And meanwhile, their suppliers had made it clear that they were not going to provide components and parts. And if you can't get the parts and the components, you're not going to build cars. And so I'm personally persuaded that that intervention was essential. And it not only kept GM going, but if GM had gone down, again, most of the experts agree that the parts and components industry would have also, there would have been a lot of bankruptcies there, and that would have caused difficulties, not just for GM, but for Ford and for all the auto manufacturers that relied on the American parts industry for supplies.
One of your areas of expertise is in globalization, and I always found it fascinating, the conversation or the idea that GM could go to China and just make a killing there, and then everything would be fine. And I keep telling people it's not that easy in China because if you do business there, well, you know that. I mean, if you do business there, you have to form a subsidiary, and they
That's right.
majority interest, and therefore get the technology.
Right, that's correct. And that for that reason, companies feel very two ways about going to China. It was really sort of the genius of Jack Smith that he said, let's go try for the Chinese market, because the simple fact is everybody knew that even apart from recession and so forth, the market for automobiles, in fact, the market for just about everything in the United States, was going to grow pretty slowly, and that the rapid growth of demand for cars would be in countries like China, and particularly China, just because it's got so very many people. And of course, the Chinese have been building roads like mad, and they've been buying cars like mad. And indeed, the money that GM now earns in China is a big part of what makes it profitable, while on the other hand, it's losing its shirt in Europe because European countries won't let companies close car plants, so they're forced to keep open plants they don't need, which of course hugely raises their costs.
Well, there's that whole thing about the European market is just in sad shape.
Yes, it is. The only companies that are making money in Europe, I guess, are VW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes. Notice they're all German companies. And furthermore, they all have a strong foot in the very high-end market. But just about everybody else is losing their shirts
It
in
seems
Europe.
almost like tag team who's got the worst debt crisis coming up, whether it's Spain or
That's right.
Portugal. Or,
That's right. Exactly.
and Germany's saying, well, there's a limit to this generosity that we've had.
That's right. And yet at the same time, part of Germany's prosperity is based on the fact that it exports to lots of the other European countries. And if they all go into severe doldrums, that will affect Germany's prosperity too.
Well, one of the factors of globalization is that we are really all linked. The
That's
markets
right.
and economies are all linked. And so what happens over in one area does affect the others, and sometimes
That's
quite
right.
severely.
That's absolutely true. And it's particularly true for the countries within the Eurozone area because they have such a high degree of interaction with one another.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed in the book is that that as you're getting these different accomplishments, then people like the Washington Press Corps started taking notice of you and figuring you were sort of the poster person. But maybe you can speak about that. How as you're doing what just you think you ought to do, you start becoming aware that it's having an impact.
I do, and as I say, I was partly annoyed with the press, and I told some of them how they treated stories about me. They eventually got over it to some extent, but initially it was all, was it Dr. Johnson who said, a woman singing is like a dog walking on its hind legs. It's not whether he does it well or ill, but that she does it at all. And their early stories were kind of like that. And then gradually they got over it and they started judging me and in some cases criticizing me, just as they would anybody in that kind of position.
But there seemed a great difficulty at looking you as a woman person accomplishing and not as girl accidentally in industry kind of a thing, it seemed like.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that is probably true. And my colleagues at GM, they always treated me with utmost correctness and didn't try to cut me off from speaking or anything. It was sort of clear that they regarded me as a bit of a third sex. I was clearly different from them, but I was also very different from their wives, who, that was their main experience with women. And it was interesting because the high-level executives used to sort of poo-poo the whole notion and concern about sexual harassment until their own daughters, clutching their MBAs, would come home and tell their fathers about some of the experiences they had gone through in the working world. And then suddenly, these executives had a kind of road to Damascus moment where they realized that this was affecting their little girls and that it must be real.
But you also discussed some of the really revealing moments, even in political and diplomatic circles, where you were being or attempted to be treated differently, not a geisha, that whole thing.
Yeah, well, in Washington back in the 70s, I used to get invited just because of my position, not for any personal reasons, to various embassy dinners. And some of the embassies would still send the ladies upstairs to powder their noses, quote unquote, while the gentlemen stayed downstairs and had their cigars and brandy and had serious talk. And so here I was, the member of the Council of Economic Advisors, upstairs powdering my nose, and there was my husband, the professor of English, downstairs listening to Arthur Burns and various European dignitaries discuss the state of the world economy and of the dollar and so forth. And this just struck me as so ridiculous that I said to my secretary, look, when I get one of these invitations from some embassy, ask them if they separate the genders after dinner. And if they say yes, tell them, I'm sorry, but she doesn't accept invitations under those conditions. And she was delighted to do it. Now, it was said that Katharine Graham, who owned the Washington Post, if that happened and it was suggested that she go upstairs and powder her nose, she simply got up and called for her limousine and left. And I didn't have a limousine at my disposal, but I did find a way of not getting put in that position.
There's other stories that you have that by virtue of being so heavily involved with some of these things, I mean, you were involved with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. I mean, there was an insider viewpoint that I found really interesting.
No, there's no question that I did get to see some aspects of these people's personalities that were not necessarily visible to the public. I remember once running into Kissinger and the president's box at the Kennedy Center, and our son, who was maybe 12 or 13, was with us that night. And he treated our son to the most incredible discussion of world events and his view of them. But the most amazing one was actually a breakfast that the three members of the Council of Economic Advisors and their spouses had with the Nixons one morning in the so-called family dining room. And it was ostensibly to say goodbye to one of the members who was going back to Stanford. And the president, about halfway through this breakfast, started the most impressive discussion. Well, I don't know, is it a discussion? I guess it was a monologue, not a discussion, about geopolitics and America's role in the world as a balancer keeping the peace, and his role in making sure that America did that. And it was brilliant and fascinating. And suddenly he turns to my husband, the English professor, and says, but of course, Professor Whitman, because you deal with students, you know that you can't tell people the truth about why you're doing things. You have to give them a story which will make them support you. And suddenly, there before our eyes, Dr. Jekyll turned into Mr. Hyde. And the president himself had no idea that the shift had taken place, or that what he'd said was in any way an insight, and not a positive insight, into his character. And it was, I never actually discussed that with my two colleagues on the council, but it was certainly burned into my memory.
A moment of truth.
A moment of truth.
Of untruth.
Exactly.
We should talk a little bit, perhaps, about the Martian, who is a central part of this narrative, but not the dominating.
I was wondering when you were going to ask me why the book was called The Martian's Daughter. And it's not because I think it might accidentally capture a few science fiction fans, but it's because there were 5 Hungarian scientists, of whom my father was one, who were called the Martians. And the story goes, and I can't personally vouch for it, was that one night a number of the people who were working on the Manhattan Project were sitting on top of the mountain in Los Alamos, drinking beer and talking, and they weren't allowed to leave, so there wasn't much to do in the evening, so they were kind of killing time. And one of them said, how come that so many of the geniuses associated with this project come from this little country that nobody can find on a map called Hungary. And somebody else said, well, the truth is, they're not really human beings at all. They're Martians. But in order to disguise the fact that they come from Mars, they all speak Hungarian. So that story kind of went viral. And there have been books written on the Martians, who, as I say, are 5 very specific people. And when I was hunting around for a title of my book, and I threw away a lot of them, it suddenly seemed to me that, why not? I am the Martian's daughter. So that's how the title came about. And my father played a very important role in my life, and certainly was one of the shapers of what I did, because his view was always that boy or girl, man or woman, your moral obligation was to use whatever mental powers God had given you to their fullest capacity. So I grew up assuming that this was something I was morally obliged to do. Now, later, that did become the source of a very difficult disagreement between my father and me, because I had met my future husband, Bob Whitman, to whom I've now been married for 56 years, when I was 17. And the very night I met him, I had announced to my roommate that this was the man I was going to marry. And we, over time, decided that we wanted to get married right after he got his PhD and I graduated from college. And my father was absolutely appalled. He liked Bob, that wasn't the point. But he felt, and this was the 1950s, that any woman who married young, and particularly married an impecunious young English professor, was cutting off any possibility of fulfilling her own intellectual and professional goals. And it's bad enough to have that kind of disagreement with a father that you love and respect, but it was worse because he knew, and I knew, that he was dying of cancer. So I was not only defying my father, but I was defying a dying father. And that was tough.
It's that same thing, though, of being involved, and then you have responsibilities to what's happening, to do even things that you're not necessarily comfortable doing, but they're important to be done. And I think this was an important task that you did very well.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
thank
so
you for
much,
being
Jim.
on Rip Rad.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.